Greetings of freedom, my dear English-speaking comrades. In this message, I address you regarding the failures and errors of American hegemony in Iraq. My comrades, the Bush administration has not seen, nor will it ever see or understand, the contradictions in its policies in Iraq, or the negative consequences that have undermined Bush's 2007 national security strategy, despite all the articles emphasizing the independence of foreign policy. The situation in the Middle East has become intractable thanks to these policies. Iran is on its way to becoming a nuclear power, and the civil war in Iraq threatens to escalate into a regional conflict. The clash of civilizations has become very close, and all these events are taking place in a region responsible for most of the world's oil supply. Perhaps the philosophy that influenced these events in the region in previous years played a central role, directing the capital of war, its management, and the corruption that became a hallmark of that war. Ideas became stubbornly entrenched as a result, and perhaps this era, rife with errors, has become the defining characteristic of all the events taking place and the motivation for all these actions to justify those failed policies by attacking the wrong enemies and creating innocent victims. This reflects their desire to make the test be decided in the streets of Baghdad. The war on terror metaphor was flawed and led to counterproductive and failed policies. 6 years after the 9th of November, the real war continued on several fronts: Iraq, Gaza, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Somalia. This war killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and angered millions around the world. Despite this, the rule did not hold. The war in Iraq may have been accepted uncritically by the American public as a clear reaction to 9/11. However, it is now widely acknowledged that the invasion of Iraq was a folly. The war on terror remains the framework within which American policy must conform, and most politicians participate in it for fear of being accused of weakness. War, by its very nature, creates innocent victims. Any war waged against any enemy generates death, injury, and humiliation for civilians, creating anger and resentment among them, their families, and their communities. This undoubtedly serves to build support for potential enemies. The war on Iraq was no exception to this rule. It produced all these legacies, and its consequences were horrific for both the enemy and the civilian population. This war also gave rise to strange political legacies that lead to the use of political movements as a single model of practices that the United States rejects in its war. Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Sunni resistance, and the Mahdi army in Iraq are very different forces, but Bush's global war against them prevents differentiating between them and dealing with them accordingly. This prevents necessary negotiations with Iran and Syria because, in the United States' view, they are supporting these countries. To this day, this war has emphasized military action, while most regional conflicts require political solutions. This has widened the gap between East and West, with each side claiming to be the victim and the other the perpetrator. This will generate lasting animosity between the conflicting parties, making it impossible for either side to win. It is an endless war waged against an invisible enemy, resulting in heavy losses among combatants and damaging the interests of all parties involved. This decline in American influence has dragged the world into a dangerous cycle of escalating violence and further deterioration. It is painful to admit that our current predicament is brought about by our own illusions. The philosophy that attributes successes to one side or the other can be used to open up your own world of imagination to a better realm. I have developed this philosophy to play a central role in the process of discovery, whether in taking on similar importance to others or in making people live inside a giant bubble. In recent years, this bubble has been attributed to the conflation of the value of possession and life with the active valuation determined by others, what is commonly referred to as the wealth effect. For several years, the source curse, oil wealth, has had a detrimental effect on the region, placing it in a strong position against American foreign policy. Opposition to the war on Iraq was misunderstood and backfired. The drive to make the world more economically and militarily secure led to the erosion of American hegemony, and the dangerously unstable Bush administration contributed to the decline of America's global power. To clarify the course of events, I must caution against fully confronting these dangers by opening up, investigating, and re-examining the conceptual framework upon which our activities as investors are based. We must act upon our personal experiences, which call for moving beyond mere comparisons and adapting accepted rules of human behavior within the framework of Islamic law. The extent of the social and political factors that contribute to elevating the perspective on human knowledge and progress may confront some of the central dilemmas of contemporary liberal thought and the management of institutions of human knowledge. Traditionally, dominant philosophy has aimed to establish an institution of knowledge and to ensure that knowledge is complete and impartial, but no theory to date can claim to contain ultimate truth. However, this does not preclude the rejection of any method that encourages following past experiences as a guide to the future, such as the method of trial and error, through which knowledge may develop before being distorted. And most of our rational beliefs are not those that have been achieved by force, but those that have come through criticism and refutation. There is a philosophy called the philosophy of error, which is often used as an expression of making excuses, and many philosophers believe that abandoning thinking is not the reason why we cannot approach the truth, which may be closer to skepticism in the end. In contrast, there is an acceptance of the possibility of error and truth to facilitate the growth of knowledge. A crucial feature of any progressive, open society is the use of trial and error, which can bring about a cumulative improvement in human life that parallels the growth of knowledge in science. However, it is important to note that when we approach human affairs and believe that the possibility of error and truth applies to human societies, we cannot assume that what is used in the natural sciences can be applied to social investigation. We cannot study the human world in the same way we study natural bodies. Social bodies are not like stars or stones. They are created, in part, by human perceptions and beliefs, and when these perceptions change, they change with the people. This makes us more prone to error, for we can never possess objective knowledge of society without our constantly shifting beliefs. This fluid relationship undermines standard economic theories that advocate for absolute freedom, and such theories may distort the image of social reality, which can be measured by the ease with which natural processes are followed. These processes are embodied in human practices and may change whenever an attempt at measurement is perceived. When we act based on a theory about society, we risk constantly altering reality. As a consequence of this fact, the acceptance of radical fallibility is a condition for the existence of a hypothetical coordination in economic models of equilibrium, which are based on the assumption of ideal knowledge, not on the possibility of abstract theory. Nevertheless, it seems reasonable to believe that the very fact of this flexibility indicates a fundamental limitation in our knowledge of the social world. Like other aspects of human life, from complex economic activity to unbalanced beliefs or unbalanced political actions, the goal of natural science is to develop theories that contain universal laws. While the social sciences deal with historical events, the fluctuations of human beliefs cannot object to such laws. It is not the unity of thought that determines the phenomenon of flexibility in the ambition of the social sciences. Philosophers and thinkers emphasize that the unity of the project has a central influence. In the Vienna School of Logical Realism, progress in ethics and politics can be achieved using the methods of science. When public policies prove ineffective or disastrous, the reason may lie in their embodiment of flawed assumptions, and these errors can be corrected through critique. This central assumption can be applied to the shortcomings of the Bush administration's policies. However, the problem, from the world's perspective, is that Bush's foreign policies demonstrated a tendency to form beliefs that can be misled. The general outlines of Bush's political doctrine were presented in 1997 regarding the United States' place in the new American century. At the end of the 20th century, the United States was the world's dominant power, and it proposed a number of policies aimed at consolidating this position. As a result of these policies, the United States entered a realm far removed from that equilibrium. There is a clear parallel between the pursuit of American hegemony and a pattern of prosperity that can be observed from time to time as being on the verge of collapse in the political, strategic, and economic spheres. The events of 9/11 came to challenge America's power and influence in the world, posing a challenge to that power more than at any other time in its history. The direct cause of this change and the impact behind the invasion of Iraq was this reckless and poorly executed adventure which undermined the very American hegemony it was meant to uphold. The Bush administration's goal was to ensure American primacy in a stable world order, but the result was a world of contradictions and a failure of the United States position. The Bush administration argued that it was adhering to a long-term doctrine, a kind of market fundamentalism, blessed by religious fundamentalism. This doctrine of enshrining American hegemony was used to support a foreign policy that emphasized competition between states rather than the possibilities of international cooperation. The current system enjoys the support of disparate groups united only by the desire for political power and influence. For most of the time since the invasion of Iraq, we see that this administration is floundering, unable to hold together during the tragic developments, and it is perhaps fanciful to assume that no justifiable theory or strategy has been implemented. However, the rise of religious fundamentalism, which until recently was on the fringes of world politics, has led to the influence of religion in the Bush administration, which has brought some of the most dangerous aspects of these influences into foreign policy and made Christian fundamentalism one of the strategies for dealing with terrorism. The new threats to the United States should be embodied in its focus on successful counter-terrorism strategies based primarily on security measures and political initiatives rather than traditional military operations. These strategies may involve concentrated military action, but campaigns of the kind the United States is waging in Iraq tend to alienate populations and raise fundamentalist levels of thinking. This war embodies the tendency to think about international conflict in theological terms, a tendency that has long been absent in American history, thus reinforcing the growing power of Christianity. Bush has repeatedly described and signaled that the war in Iraq was waged against evil. Given that evangelical conservatives are a powerful force in Republican funding and voting, there is little doubt that they constitute the intended audience for Bush's rhetoric and its implications. The role of Christian right in the Bush administration is not simply that of an ally to be courted and appeased, but rather it clarifies the connection to that administration's worldview. Beliefs about the millennium shape and reflect the thinking of the administration, in a secular American government that openly formulates its ideas based on religious forms. If we look back at recent history, we find that such beliefs have fueled similar movements and have not disappeared in modern times. They are a continuous series of global political thought patterns. We see that the production of authoritarian ideologies in the 20th century has been reproduced in different ways. Nazism and communism claimed to be based on science, but in reality, they used those ideologies merely as a means or expression of suggestive myths. Every major belief in history was on the verge of tearing apart what came before it and opening up a new world. This political role of beliefs may reveal today the relationship between doctrines and politics, while emphasizing that politicians present their ideas based on modern scientific social theories, not on those doctrines and ideas. From this comes the new political pronouncement that humanity is on the brink of a new era, led by the United States, of a global democratic revolution, and that all tyranny will fall forever. The actions of Americans today, it is argued, stem from an absolute faith in prophecy or divine inspiration. This is perhaps most evident in the discourse of Anglicans who speak of the decisive battle and the end times, the end of history. The belief is taking root that the raging conflagration in the Middle East will open the door to a new world order. Many theorists and politicians share the view that the theory of Christian right is not an empirical hypothesis that can be reviewed based on experience. For those who accept it, it is a revelation of the truth. Similarly, the world will appreciate the adoption of an American version of democracy. The current Bush administration's foreign policy is based on faith rather than rational engagement with the world. To explain the disastrous foreign policy record of the Bush administration after the 9th of November, we find a series of errors. According to this interpretation, American society is an open society and the strongest in the world, and the threat it faced was a threat to world peace and stability. The administration exploited this interpretation and the shock it caused to stifle critics of its policies, and the events after the 9th of November led to a deep-seated bias towards the Nazi and communist experiences. This bias is evident in its conceptual framework and is based on that experience, both in terms of accepting and rejecting it, in shaping its policies. This will make the United States become an authoritarian regime, and democracy will continue to function with an independent judiciary and the rule of law. The missing element here is the pivotal political role of Christian religious fundamentalism. After the attacks, it activated suggestive beliefs among American society, and the Bush administration had to mobilize those beliefs to support its policies by making Bush share those beliefs. Systems such as the belief in the superiority of the species and the Christian right to a worldview emerged, embodying a historical perspective framed by eschatological concepts. According to this view, American power could be used to rid the world of evil. Under these theological conditions, the belief was held that human action could eradicate evil, and that only empirical standards could be applied to attempts to impose these ideas. For much of the last century, it seemed that the entrapment of power by irrational systems of belief could only occur in dictatorships. Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union were closed societies whose ruling doctrines were beyond any form of criticism. While the success of liberal democracy in defeating its rivals and spreading throughout the world made it easy to assume that it possessed an internal maturity that gave it precedence and strength over any form of authoritarianism, open societies were, almost, liberal democracies, and they seem to emerge when dictatorships fall. From this, we arrive at the conclusion that the collapse of a closed society does not lead to an open society, rather, it leads to the ongoing collapse and disintegration that follows a period of calm or stability. Thus, any minor division within an open society threatens all directions, such as broad freedom, which turns into anarchy, and failed states on the one hand. On the other hand, the imposition and spread of fundamentalist doctrines leads to authoritarian regimes. In reality, when closed societies collapse, they fail to transition to openness, not because they have succumbed to anarchy or are threatened by a return to dictatorship. Rather, they may be forced to adopt a narrow interpretation of democracy while distancing themselves from any form of liberal democratic tradition. If we look back at Locke's experiences and the English Civil War, we find a similar model, as do Rousseau's writings on the French Revolution, which established democracy as a popular expression. From this, we can understand that the theocratic, electoral governments that emerged in most of post-Saddam Iraq are democratic in this sense, as are the current regime in Iran and the Hamas government in Palestine. Such democracies are often characterized by a lack of freedoms, such as freedom of information and expression, and legal constraints on governmental power, all essential features of a liberal democracy. In this respect, they diverge from dictatorships. Democracy, whose foundation is elections and the appropriation of power in the name of the majority, can be more Christian oppressive in terms of violating individual freedoms and minority rights, and may often be even more so than dictatorships in this regard, to the point of suppressing any cultural freedom. While authoritarian regimes are often far superior to open societies, they sometimes employ reason in formulating their policies more consistently and successfully than even well-established liberal democracies. This was clearly manifested in the continued expansion of Russian power after the collapse of the Soviet Union, making it a major player in the international system, albeit partially. This was particularly evident during the global energy crisis, which enabled Russia to assert itself in international affairs and disregard any Western opposition to its domestic policies, which proved highly effective in achieving its objectives. The existence of vast reserves of natural resources, oil and natural gas, further bolstered Russia's resurgence as a major power. These resources were used to solidify European and international dependence on Russian energy supplies, and Putin effectively advanced Russia's geopolitical interests. He portrayed his mistakes, such as his intervention in Ukraine, as miscalculations rather than strategic errors, thus enabling him to successfully overcome them. Another example of this is Chinese foreign policy as a realistic pattern. In the same way, while Russia and China advance, the United States suffers from a loss of power and influence due to the many avoidable mistakes made by the Bush administration. However, its central folly lies in the fact that it is implementing a foreign policy based on the utopian belief that it is mandated by God to do these things. In fact, instead of recognizing and correcting its mistakes, this administration tends to compound those mistakes, including the escalation of the current conflict in the Middle East, precisely because the threat of American military action against Iran can appear justified from the point of view of that administration. Their concern is heightened by Iran's rise as a dominant power in the Persian Gulf and its direct influence in Iraq. The removal of Saddam Hussein, the main counterbalance to Iran's regional power, has been removed, creating the conditions for the emergence of an Islamic regime that will be increasingly subject to Tehran influence. American airstrikes against Iran would only exacerbate the negative consequences of war. In terms of its severe impact on global oil infrastructure, and the negative effects on American oil facilities, while benefiting Russian oil facilities, this strike will also increase the impact in the Arabian Gulf and throughout the Islamic world on the rise of the ideological trend among Shiite followers. Despite the ideological similarities between the American and Iranian administrations in their reliance on ideological thought to shape foreign policy in both countries, and the disastrous consequences that will ensue. However, the overall result will be to accelerate the decline of American hegemony, which began with the occupation of Iraq. Less than 20 years after the collapse of communism, the rising powers in the international system will be authoritarian regimes that will not tolerate any open political opposition. Closed societies will prove more capable of framing and implementing rational strategies than open societies. Throughout history, and outside of natural equilibrium, open societies cannot be immune to the erosion of faith among their citizens over time and with the development of civilization. This is especially true if their foreign policies are based on dogmatic beliefs with irrational and counterproductive outcomes. Since Donald Trump's return to the White House, his impact on international politics has been enormous. His approach to the wars in Ukraine, Europe, and Gaza, as well as his announcement of exceptional tariffs and their subsequent partial reversal, have severely damaged the image of the United States among allies, rivals, and investors. While the Trump administration and its supporters see these measures as strengthening the United States' global standing, its critics assert the opposite. Although Trump's second term is still in its early stages, a serious question remains: is it truly overlooking massive geopolitical strategic errors that will weaken the United States in the long run? In billiards and other games, there are errors called miscalculations, which originate from the player themselves, not from their opponent's efforts. The same applies to geopolitical affairs, and history is replete with such errors, where governments, not at the behest of external powers, make poor decisions that lead to setbacks and even major disasters. The United States has had its fair share of these errors, the most recent being the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Most historians agree that targeting Saddam Hussein was a deliberate choice by the U.S. administration, not something imposed upon them. Attacking the Taliban for harboring al-Qaeda in retaliation for the September 11, 2001 attacks was sufficient. However, the war ultimately weakened the United States' position in the Middle East by exposing the limits of American military power and providing a platform for both Iran and Al-Qaeda, separately, to expand and flourish. Furthermore, as U.S. policymakers directed resources to the Middle East during the first decade of this century, they paid little attention to the rise of China. Although the United States entered Iraq as the undisputed global hegemon, the war, a decade later, contributed to the emergence of a multipolar world and the decline of American dominance. In some ways, the Iraq War echoed the earlier U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, a strategic blunder stemming from miscalculation. By the time Richard Nixon was able to withdraw U.S. forces from Southeast Asia, America's global credibility had been severely damaged, its economy faltered, and its social cohesion undermined. However, Washington managed to regain its global standing, which may prove that such mistakes do not necessarily lead to irreversible decline. Therefore, the extent of the damage caused by a strategic error depends on the global and domestic context. The Iraq War inflicted greater damage on the United States because it occurred at a time when China was experiencing rapid growth. In contrast, although the Soviet Union, the United States' Cold War rival, enjoyed a brief boost during the 1970s, Washington was only partially able to regain its global standing after the Vietnam War because Moscow itself had been in decline since the 1980s. The Soviet Union's situation was exacerbated by a similar miscalculation when it invaded and occupied Afghanistan. This drained Soviet resources, damaged its already struggling economy, and weakened its international standing. In retrospect, however, the occupation of Afghanistan merely stimulated and accelerated a pre-existing pattern of decline, rather than initiating it. The same can be said of another strategic miscalculation, the United Kingdom's involvement in the Suez Crisis of 1956. At a time when British power was already waning, the crisis in Egypt exposed London's vulnerability, accelerating its global decline. Do Trump's actions constitute similar errors, and what kind of long-term damage might they cause? The tariffs imposed by Trump on Liberation Day in April sent shockwaves through global markets, the full repercussions of which may take years to understand. Although prominent commentators, such as The Economist, had previously warned that Trump might oust the dollar from its position as the undisputed global reserve currency, and while it is unlikely that the euro and other currencies will replace the dollar anytime soon, Trump's actions have increased concerns about the reliability of the White House, and consequently the reliability of the dollar. This has led investors to believe, for the first time in decades, that the dollar may no longer be the safe haven it once was. The dollar has already lost 9% of its value since January 2025, and some suggest that the extraordinary privilege enjoyed by the United States, a privilege that allows it to keep interest rates on government debt low due to the dollar's global popularity, may be at risk. This will not only lead to a financial crisis within the country, as the U.S. government will have to find ways to pay for high borrowing costs by cutting spending, but it will also damage the credibility of the United States abroad. But this situation is not imminent, and much will depend on how determined Trump is to impose the tariffs, after having already backed down somewhat under market pressure, and on how international investors react. Perhaps the most glaring mistake is Trump's provocative approach to his international allies. His criticism of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the cutting of aid to Kiev, his frequent clashes with European leaders, the defunding of the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the questions he raises about the future of NATO, along with the tariffs, all raise questions about the reliability of the United States as an international ally. In the short term, this situation has led European leaders to increase their defense spending, something Trump and his allies have long demanded. In the long run, this will push America's Western allies toward a geopolitical vision in which Washington no longer occupies its position as leader of the free world. China has already sought to capitalize on this situation, urging the European Union and the United Kingdom to reverse some of the strategic decoupling from the Chinese economy that Western leaders agreed upon under Joe Biden. It remains to be seen whether these moves will prove to be strategic miscalculations on the scale of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Historical precedents, however, do not bode well. The United States' global position was not particularly strong before Trump's return to office. Arguably, the US was already considerably weaker than it had been before the Vietnam War or the invasion of Iraq, as the world transitioned to a multipolar system. If Trump's tariffs and his damaging actions toward allies prove as destructive as some critics suggest, it is plausible that this situation could end up resembling the Suez Crisis for Britain or the invasion of Afghanistan for the Soviet Union, an acceleration of a pre-existing trend of geopolitical decline. Of course, the Trump administration is still in its early days, and perhaps global markets and alliances will be able to adapt to the new way of doing business, thus limiting long-term damage. But history suggests that the United States is not immune to strategic miscalculations, and its government may have already committed many in the past few months. Thank you, my friends, thank you very much. Greetings of freedom. Iraq is greater. Humanity is greater.